Once again, hello everybody. Welcome to this week's virtual Curator Spotlight from Cooperstown, New York. Not too far from the National Baseball Hall of Fame and Museum. Very glad to be with you today. For those who don't know me, my name is Bruce Markison, working in the Education Department at the Hall of Fame. And joining us today is our Vice President of Exhibitions and Collections, Erik Strohl. He heads up our team of curators at the Hall of Fame, oversees all of the exhibits that we have. And on today's program, we are going to look at an exhibit up on our third floor. It's a very popular exhibit. It is quite colorful. It's got a lot of stories, a lot of numbers, and it's also got an interesting interactive element. It is an exhibit that we call One for the Books, and it's a place where we look at the records of the game and tell the stories behind those records. Joining us today once again, we've had him for a couple of previous programs. We're glad to have him once again, Erik Strohl. Erik, how are you today?
I'm great, Bruce. How are you? Thanks for having me again.
Well, I'm getting used to this working at home thing, maybe getting too used to it in a sense, but we're making the best we can. Our virtual plaque gallery studio here on well, I shouldn't say our exact address. It's an undisclosed location just outside of the village of Cooperstown. But today, Erik, we talk about an exhibit that I know is a particular favorite of yours, one that you were heavily involved in creating back in 2011, 9 years ago. The exhibit about the game's records, One for the Books. We're going to show some images from that exhibit, give people some idea of what it looks like up on the third floor. Here's a photograph, Erik, from the opening back in 2011. I actually missed this. I was not working at the Hall at the time, but it was quite a day. You had two Hall of Famers, Cal Ripken Jr. and Phil Niekro, that were there. Tell us what you remember about the ribbon cutting ceremony for the exhibit.
Well, the ribbon cuttings are always, they're fun events. It's the culmination of a lot of hard work by a lot of people. A large team of people from the exhibits and design departments and education and collections, and you just don't dream up of an exhibit and have it done in weeks. Generally it takes us, if you want to do the process properly, 18 months to 2 years from when you first start brainstorming the ideas and then actually design what it's going to look like, and then make the mounts and install it and fabricate it. So it's a long labor of love. And when you get to the ribbon cutting, it's a great relief, of course, that everything is ready to go and you're excited to unveil it to the public. And then, almost always we have the great joy of having Hall of Famers present for our major exhibit opening. So that is, something that I always look forward to. And I'm sure everybody out there can understand, how fun that is to be able to spend some time with these guys. So yeah, right here, you're seeing Cal and Phil, who are there for the opening. And they're playing with the touchscreen interactive, which we'll talk about a little bit later. Of course, both the guys are in the exhibit. Cal with his consecutive game streak, and we will also talk about that in a little more detail shortly. And the thing about Cal that always gets me is how big he is, right? Unless you met Cal Ripken in person, he's just massive. He's super tall, and you're like, this guy played shortstop. He is such a big guy. So you have him, and then you have Phil there, and Phil's in the exhibit as well, both with 3,000 strikeouts and 300 wins, and his 3,000th strikeout cap with the Yankees is there in the exhibit. So they're having some fun checking the things out.
There are not four of them there. That's just a reflection of Niekro and Ripken that you see on the right side of your screen. Just want to clarify that. So it was certainly an exciting day 9 years ago to open the exhibit. And as we go through the exhibit, kind of from start to finish, here we have the introductory panel on the left side of the screen. Explain to us, Erik, exactly what that panel tells us, and give us an overview of the three broader themes contained in One for the Books.
Sure. So this was a project, like I said, that we worked on for a long time. Tom Schieber, our senior curator, was the lead curator on this project. And he did a great job leading the team and coming up with the final product you have. But it's a combination of a hard work of many people. And you always want to settle on a few themes in an exhibit. You don't want to try to go off on too many roads, too many paths. You want to have some clarity. It's not a book or a novel. There is economy of language, and you're trying to get your point across to people. So we did have a few themes for this exhibit that we thought were important. Basically 3 main words. One word was pinnacles, meaning that baseball records are the tally of statistics, and you use that tally of statistics to compare players to one another and see who has the most in any certain category or any certain statistic, and that's how you measure the greatest players in the game. Another word we used for this exhibit was sacred records. And I'm sure everybody out there who's watching, you can understand this. And baseball is different than the other sports. And it's easy for me to say as a curator at the Hall of Fame, but there's magic numbers, there's sacred numbers that people that aren't even necessarily baseball fans recognize those numbers, whether it's 714, which was Babe Ruth's home run number, 755 that Henry Aaron finished with, or 56 for DiMaggio's hitting streak, or 511 for Cy Young's wins. The other sports, they all keep a tally of statistics, but it's rare that you find somebody who can rattle off, how many goals Wayne Gretzky had, or what's the total career record for passing yards in an NFL career. But in baseball, they have this kind of sacredness to them. And even those records that have been broken, speaking of Cal, and we'll get to him, you had 2130 for Lou Gehrig, and then 2131 breaking that, and Cal ending with 2632. These are numbers that resonate. So that was definitely a theme of the exhibit that we wanted to come across. And then perhaps I think most importantly, Bruce, is the idea of context. Baseball, because it has such a long history and we'd be keeping tallies of records and numbers that players have been achieving in seasons since the 1800s, we have this idea that we can compare things, right? That we can compare Babe Ruth to Joe DiMaggio, to Mickey Mantle, to Derek Jeter, if you're just going to use Yankees as an example. And it's an illusion of comparison, however, and that's something that we try to get across to people. There's so many ways that baseball statistics and numbers are different and have different meanings over eras. So it's not as simple as saying so-and-so did this in 1930 and so-and-so did this in 1975, and they've got a higher number. That means they were better. And we're going to get into more of these, but just a few as we start out here. One I always like to bring up, of course, is the fact that in baseball, out of all the team sports that there are, it's the only one that does not use a standardized playing surface, right? The diamond's the same shape and dimensions at every field, but the ballparks, the stadiums, have different layouts. So if you're playing in Fenway Park as opposed to Petco Park, or an example we'll talk about shortly, Forbes Field, where the Pirates played, as opposed to PNC Park now, if you're a pitcher in one, you may certainly enjoy being in a large park, but if you play in a bandbox, your numbers are going to be affected. So it's already apples and oranges. It's not an equal playing surface for all players. And you could go down the list of things, and as I said, we're going to talk about more of them as we move through this, but changes in equipment is one, of course, right? When we start off, nobody's using baseball gloves at all for the first number of decades in baseball. And then when you do have gloves, they're mainly for protection, and they're not really a tool, a hinge for catching like today's gloves. So players' capability of playing defense is going to be changed by the equipment that they use. Same goes with changes in rules, and that's something else we're gonna talk about. Whether it's the change in the pitching distance from the mound to the catcher, or how many strikes make an out, or balls make a walk, or whatever the case might be, that changes over time, and that means that there's, again, an illusion of comparison. You've got things like strength and conditioning now, where players have full-time nutritionists and trainers. So that's certainly different than the players of many decades ago in terms of how they were able to prepare and what assets they had available to them. Things like surgery now, with Tommy John, what if we could have fixed Sandy Koufax's arm? And those numbers could have been different. And there's several other things that we're going to get into. And then there's also research. The fact that numbers are changed. They are what we thought they were by the standards of the time and the people that were counting them. But with our ability to access so much more data now, and particularly online, we can have people be armchair researchers at home, and they are. And people go and find things in the record book that perhaps were missed, or a hit was counted or not counted, or an RBI was counted or not counted, and then records change without players even doing anything. So it's a complex thing, and I think people think about stats very simply, and it's like you think about, well, who was the most all-time ever in this, and we love to compare them, but every step along the way in the history of baseball, there is changes which affect those numbers. So a couple other points. When we were doing this exhibit, and when you have record books, for example, right, the compilation of numbers in books, they used to come in books. There isn't many now. I think Elias may be the only one who does a book. It's all online. But there was those simple questions of the who, the what, the when, and the where. Those are always answered in the books. Who did it? What's the record we're talking about? Where did it occur? When did it happen? And that's easy to follow when you look through these books. But what we tried to drill down into, and what's really important, is the how and the why.
Yeah.
How did a record happen? Why did it happen that way? Why is it different now than it was then, so to speak? So, yeah, it's not just how you look at them, but the questions you ask when you're looking at the numbers.
Let's take a look at some of these specific aspects to this exhibit. This one I find enjoyable, the Honey Boy Trophy. Honey Boy is not a reference to an Adam Sandler movie. It is a reference to a real-life person, a trophy that was given out many years ago, and it actually tells us a story about a major statistical error that was made. Tell us about that, Erik.
Yeah, excuse me. So Honey Boy, the Honey Boy Trophy was given by a man named Honey Boy Evans, and he was a vaudeville minstrel. And back in the day, he gave a batting trophy out to the leading batter in both leagues. I mean, not each league separately, in all of Major League Baseball from 1908 to 1912. It only happened 5 years in a row. And this one's the third one, the middle one, in 1910. And Honus Wagner won the first one in 1908, and Ty Cobb won the next four. And I don't know if Honey Boy got tired of just handing out trophies to Ty Cobb, but it stopped after that. Everyone would have known who Honey Boy was back at the time. He would have been a very well-known face, just like a celebrity or theater star today. So this trophy is from 1910, and we start off the exhibit with this for a reason, because we want to talk about the changes in numbers. And there's a record that Ty Cobb was thought to have held, which was consecutive batting titles won, which was 9 from 1907 to 1915. And in 1910, the batting championship came down to the wire. And he barely beat out Nap Lajoie for the batting title to keep his streak alive, which he kept going. And it was later found out, and this is many decades later, that there was an error made in the score sheets for the tallying of Ty Cobb's statistics in 1910. There had been a doubleheader on the date of September 24th, and the person who was keeping the records did not mark it down as a doubleheader. They put one game in September 24th and then one game in September 25th, I think was an off day. Later, they went back and found that there were no stats for that second game on the 24th, so they added them back in, thereby double counting that game. They realized they had made the error by the end of the season, and they took them out, but what we didn't realize was that Ty Cobb's hits were not altered. All his other Tigers teammates in that game, numbers had been altered. So if you take away 2 of his hits, his batting average becomes 383, and Nap Lajoie has 384 and wins the batting title in 1910, thereby breaking up his streak and giving Rogers Hornsby the title of consecutive years winning a batting championship with 6 from 1920 to 25. So that's just one example, and we thought we'd start with that, saying here's a number that people may have known about Ty Cobb, a great famous player, and they knew how proficient he was in winning batting titles. But yet, many years later, if you look at the numbers, he really didn't win that one. And so that changes the record books, so to speak.
So this error was not discovered for many years.
Right. Like I said, they knew it at the time. By the end of the season, they'd figured it out, but they didn't realize that Ty Cobb's numbers had not been altered like the rest of his teammates. So, many decades later. And so, you never know. And that also, there's other things with Ty Cobb's numbers that are the same way. We know of 4191 is his hit total. particularly in the 80s as Pete was going to pass it. But now the accepted total for Ty Cobb is 41.89. So, you know, numbers change when you can dig down into the record books and the ledgers and find that mistakes have occurred.
And while we might not think these kinds of errors can happen in this computerized era in which we live, well, that's not always the case. One thing that can happen is sometimes an official scorer will rule a particular batted ball a hit, and then maybe later on, after considering some complaints from some of the participants, the official score might change to an error, and sometimes that doesn't always get translated. So sometimes errors can still be made even in the here and now. Let's talk about Lou Gehrig, someone whom we prominently feature in our education curriculum. We do a program, Character Education, both through virtual field trips and also on-site. Lou Gehrig and The Streak, and I guess the highlight here, although it's just one of many artifacts we'll talk about in this exhibit, is the complete Yankee uniform. And you were telling me this is actually his final uniform from 1939.
Yeah, final year, and it's great that we have that and we're able to display it. And this goes back to the sacred numbers I was talking about, one of the themes of the exhibit, right? This is something that people find staggering. Of course, Lou Gehrig's personal story, the irony of it can't be denied, where you have a guy who's called the Iron Horse, who doesn't miss a game for almost 14 seasons and is known as being basically invincible, eventually getting felled by an incurable disease. So you have that whole backstory, which makes it even more poignant and culturally impressive in terms of how we remember what occurred. And then you have Cal who passes that, and we have them here together. And Lou's still alive when you think about how we talk about that record. Even though Cal's the record holder, we still hold former record holders in high honor. And this is just that one example, you know, and for many of people watching, you know, we may have been watching when Cal passed him at 21:31, and then when he finished and played his final game and ended at 26:32, which was 17 seasons basically without missing a day at work. Can you imagine that? Everybody listening out there. And I think the total is, if you look at Cal's career from the day the streak started and the day the streak ended, 5,045 major league players went on the disabled list during the span of his streak, and he didn't miss a game. So yeah, that's an impressive feat. So you can see there in that case down there's the helmet he wore when he passed Gehrig with 21:31. That trophy that's in front of Gehrig's jersey there was given to him, I think it was a Sporting News, I can't remember exactly, when he passed the record holder prior to him, a man named Everett Scott, who had the record of, I think it was 1,309. That was an award given to him when he passed and created the new record. And actually down there on the bottom, those shoes are from the Japanese record holder, Sachio Kinagasa, who's called the Japanese Lou Gehrig, who also eventually passed Lou's number in the late 80s, ended up with 2,200 some games. So, you know, each of these cases kind of talks about a different stat or a different, in this case, longevity, consecutive games played, and we try to give it some context. And you also see what looks like a picture of Cal in there up top is actually a video. It doesn't have audio, but it's a video that shows that moment. And so we have what we call these little lollipop video screens that are in a number of the cases so that you get some video component.
You mentioned the Ripken helmet, which is to the left of Gehrig, the Kinugasa spikes right below that. Also here, we have an artifact from Maury Wills, who owns a lesser-known record.
Yeah, so you can see that to the case to the right, there's some shoes there that are on the deck. And those are shoes worn by Maury Wills in 1962 when he set the record for games played in a season with 165. Now, one may ask, how is that possible in a 162 game season? Well, again, it's him taking advantage of rules that don't exist any longer today. When the 62 season ended, the Dodgers and the Giants were tied for the National League pennant. So they played a best of three. It's only been a best of one ever in the American League, but it was a best of three for a while in the National League. And therefore, he played all those games. They ended up losing to the Giants, who then went on and played the Yankees in the World Series. But that's a record that is unbeatable by today's standards, because you can't play that many games unless, of course, we change the length of the season.
Yeah. To the far right is a bat, and that's Hack Wilson's, right?
Yeah, that's the RBI case there, and that is Hack Wilson's bat. Another great Hall of Famer and record that many baseball fans recognize is RBIs in a season. So in 1930, Hack Wilson had 190 RBIs. Think about how amazing that is. We might have a handful that get over 100 RBIs a year now, get up into 120, maybe a little more, but 190. This was also a case where a number of decades later, I think it wasn't until the 70s or 80s that researchers found that an RBI had been missing from his tally. It was not listed in the box line score of that game. It was a game in July that year, I think. But it was listed in the descriptive, the narrative accounts of the game that were in a number of newspapers. So, here's a case where Hack Wilson ended up breaking his own record many decades later by not doing anything. It was just an error in tallying, and 191 RBIs is amazing. Just one note on RBIs while we're talking about them, because we just were talking about Lou Gehrig, and the spotlight is, to have some fun with numbers during Stats Week. Lou Gehrig is also prodigious and has the American League record for RBIs in the season. But when you think about what Lou Gehrig did on the field, right, and he's batting behind Babe Ruth. Babe Ruth's batting third, he's batting fourth. So Babe Ruth's clearing those bases a lot. And you think about Lou Gehrig's RBI numbers, he had 7 seasons with 150 or more RBI, batting behind Babe Ruth. So, that's a testament to his greatness when you start looking at numbers like runs batted in.
Stick with the RBIs for the all-time career leader, Hank Aaron. He has had this record since the mid-1970s, and it has never been broken.
Yeah, another number that it seems unapproachable, but one will never know. We will see. That was a record that he broke. That was Babe Ruth's. Now, if you look at Babe Ruth's total when he retired of RBIs, it was less than 2,000. But you have to remember they did not tally RBIs until 1920. So the first 6 seasons that Babe Ruth played, RBIs were not kept. So, historians have retroactively gone back and attempted to assign him RBIs in the games in which he played during those years. But they could never get quite an agreement on that number, whether it was in the high 2100s or 2200. I think 2208 was somewhere around there where it was when Aaron passed it. And that was the number they were using at the time for Aaron. But Babe Ruth's RBI records total still not quite known, but we know for sure that regardless of what you take as the number for Ruth, Aaron surpassed that, and that's the ball from that record RBI.
And I guess the difficulty with recreating the RBIs, they pretty much had to rely on box scores, and sometimes you think you have an RBI and maybe you don't.
Right. It's not. Remember, you're not getting play-by-play of what's going on. You're just looking at a box score. So sometimes it is hard to tell. Yeah.
Amazing. 2,297 from Hank Aaron. Here we go back a little bit in time. We're really not following a time theme. We're really kind of going through the exhibit in terms of where everything is located spatially. Here's a player a lot of fans will not be familiar with, Levi Meyerle. And this is what is called a photographic card. Explain the significance of this.
It's actually a scorecard with an albumin photograph on the front, and it dates from the early National Association. Levi Meyerle played in the National Association, which was the first major pro league prior to the National League. It existed from 1871 to 75. Now, it was a player-run league, not an owner-run league, which is one of the great differences on what happened with the National League and why the National League still exists today. There's some historians who don't consider it a major league because there was a lot of contract jumping and schedules weren't always identical for teams that were playing. And it was basically disorganized chaos at times. And so there are some that feel like maybe those numbers shouldn't be counted as major league numbers. But in 1871, that first year, he batted 492, which is obviously an extremely high number. And you think, how is that possible? And really, should it count? That season was unbelievably short, and his team played only 28 games that year. He played in 26 of them. And I think he had about 138 plate appearances. Now that, whether he could have sustained that batting average over a season that we would have today is certainly a question. But even by today's standards of 3.1 plate appearances per game played, he would have achieved that number by today's averages that are used. So, here's an instance where this is somebody that most people have never heard of, but he has the highest single season batting average in Major League history. Now, to talk a little bit more about batting averages, there's been 35 times where players batted over 400. And if you look at what's considered the second highest batting average to him, let's say you're one of those historians who don't think that Meyerle's number should be included. You have a man named Q Duffy who in 1894 batted 440, and that's considered the second highest batting average in history, with a caveat. In 1887, a player named Tip O'Neill, who ended up winning the Triple Crown that year, batted 485. But there were certain things about that season in 1887 which made it different. One was that for that season and that season alone, walks counted both as hits and as at-bats, and they don't count as either now. So obviously that's inflating your numbers. The other thing is that the number of strikes needed for a strikeout was increased from 3 to 4. And I think any batter would like to tell you that if I have an extra swing after 3 strikes to still continue my at-bat, those numbers are going to be higher. Again, historians retroactively went back. You can't really figure out the impact of the 3 to 4 strikes, but you can with the walks. And so if you take away those walks that were considered hits and at-bats, his batting average drops down to about 435, I think, which then gives Hugh Duffy that second highest number. So again, looking at particularly rule changes in the 19th century and into the 20th, and how you tallied things and how things were accounted for, can change certainly things like stats that are computed as averages.
Ted Williams would have liked those rules. 4 strikes, walks count as hits. He might have batted 500 one of those years. And he coincidentally is the subject of this exhibit that we're going to talk about. It's one of my favorites. We see the 406 batting average from 1941. So in your opinion, Erik, why is it that nobody has been able to hit 400 in nearly 80 years since?
Well, yeah, it's a great discussion, and I think that it's one that baseball fans love to debate, and I think that you can go into a various number of reasons, but certainly some of the ones I mentioned before are have great impact. So defensive equipment, for sure. In Ted Williams' era, the size of the gloves and how they were constructed, particularly when he started his career earlier in his career, is not the same type of glove that an outfielder can have today. So you're certainly going to have better defensive capability from players because they're using better equipment now. You also have that strength and conditioning thing that we talked about a little bit, where players now are bigger, faster, and stronger, able to get to batted balls quicker, that sort of thing. So that certainly has to be a factor. But to me, too, it's the philosophy of the game and how pitchers and pitching has changed and evolved over time. During Ted's era, of course, it wouldn't be uncommon where you'd see a starting pitcher four times in a game, 5 times in a game, right? You let Ted Williams size up a guy on any given day and go up there that many times against the same pitcher, your chances of success are going to increase. With the increased specialization role that pitchers have now with closers particularly, and you see pitchers get applauded when they come out of the game after 5 innings. Could you imagine how Cy Young would have felt about that? But now you have a pitcher coming in the 6th, the 7th, the 8th, and the 9th. They're situational pitchers. They're changing lefty and righty. Every one of these guys is pitching 85 to 100, and you're seeing them once, and then it's a different guy the next time you're up. So those are just a few of the reasons, but certainly, now you're using pitchers differently, and these factors can contribute to batters' batting averages being lower, and we've only seen a few serious attempts, right, since that time. Tony Gwynn during the strike year, George Brett in 1980, and these guys got close. But it also shows how unbelievably difficult it is to maintain that consistency over the length of a long baseball season. And in fact, when Ted did that, right, I mean, it was famous. He was below 400 going to that last doubleheader to be played that year. And both the Red Sox and their opponents were out of the playoff race, so there really was no meaning. And the Boston manager told Ted, hey, if you want to sit out, that's fine. And of course, he would have none of that. And he went and he played both games of that doubleheader and went, was it 5 for 8 or 6 for 8, and ended up with a batting average of 406. And that's the last time that we had seen that. It seems amazing, right? That's a long time ago. Yeah. A lot of baseball play has been played since then, but nobody's been able to attain that mark. And that's one of those numbers, 406 in 1941, which was a unbelievable year for hitters, right? You also had Joe DiMaggio's 56-game hitting streak, and Joe wins the MVP. So, you have what Ted did, and he still couldn't win an MVP doing what had occurred that year. So it's amazing to look back and study some of these things.
Here's a close-up of that exhibit case, a beautiful copy of Life magazine. Our younger viewers may not be familiar. Life magazine was extremely popular back in the 40s, 50s, before it eventually went out of business. There have been some efforts to resuscitate it at various times, but it was one of the major publications. And for a baseball player to make Life the cover, that's a big deal.
Oh yeah, absolutely. There's not that many players that transcend sport to become cultural icons. That's not a sport magazine, right? Yeah, that is a magazine of American life and culture. So to have a sports figure attain the cover of something like Life, it shows you the impact that person was having on society and how many people were taking notice.
Let's talk about a lesser-known record. Chief Wilson was a player for the Pittsburgh Pirates. And he has a record that will likely never be broken given the current way that baseball is played and given the way that ballparks are. 36 triples in a season. Not to diminish what Chief Wilson did, but as you pointed out to me when we talked about this earlier, he was helped by his ballpark, the dimensions.
Yeah, sure. And you can see a little, we did a graphic there that shows you what Forbes Field looks like, which is the bigger outline. And look at that, left center is 462 feet, right, to the fence. 360 to the left corner, 376 down the right field line. And then superimposed in that is PNC Park, where you can see what the dimensions were to that parts of that field. The Pirates played almost 60 seasons in Forbes Field, and I think it's 29 seasons they led the league in triples. And Chief Wilson was quite adept as hitting that ball there in that gap and getting that ball back to the wall. Obviously, if the fences are farther away, you're going to hit less home runs, but you're going to have more long hits. In modern ballparks and stadiums, it's rare to see anything like those dimensions, right? So in any part of the field. So here's an instance where the records and the ability of players the capability of players of breaking records is going to be restricted by factors outside of their control, like the ballpark size in which they play. 36 is a huge number right now. If you have 100 triples in a career, that's that's Hall of Fame caliber numbers or top echelon player numbers. And he did more than a third of that in 1 year. And this is back during the time when Sam Crawford, who owns the career record with more than 300 career triples, you can see again how that would occur.
Interesting. Another great aspect to this exhibit is the interactive feature, which the kids especially love. I have a little more trouble because I'm older and I'm not so good with technology, but once I get the hang of it, you can do a lot with this. Tell us about the interactive feature, how this came about.
Yeah, so this is really one of the neatest parts of the exhibit that is obviously not static, that you can interact with, hence called an interactive. And this is the first time we attempted a foray into technology that was quite this complicated. And really what it is a baseball time machine. And you can go up there and at the bottom there's two separate stations. Those two sides you see there do the same thing. And at the bottom of each one of them, there is a timeline of baseball history. And you could slide the cursor to at any year, and you can basically take a time machine back to anywhere you want. And then in a whole number of hitting statistics and pitching statistics and fielding statistics, you can look at who was the all-time and the active career leader in a certain stat in that year, and who was the all-time and the active, who was the career leader and active leader in single season in each of those statistics. So you can look at all-time records and single season records. So people like to go back and look at the year they were born, for example, and say, okay, well, at this point in 1972, this is who was the all-time leader, and this is who had the single season record at these times. And it allows you to really explore how baseball stats have evolved. So it's fun, it's flashy, it's got lots of neat imagery, but it also, there's a lot of work that went on behind the scenes with this. We worked directly with Sean Foreman of baseballreference.com, and he's responsible for all the reference sports stat sites, and tremendous guy to work with, and we were able to have him help us with the technology here, so that it's really being updated to the current moment directly through the internet. So although we're all cognizant we're not playing baseball right now, but if somebody were at the hall today and the season were going on, and they could go in today and then they can go in tomorrow, and if something happened, a number would be changed automatically without us having to enter anything. So yeah, that's a fun part of that exhibit, and something that we're really excited about.
As I remember with the old records room, they used to update that every week, which was pretty good. But this, as you say, can be done every day. Here's another view. And this, for example, if somebody was born in 2001, the kids especially love to look up the year of their birth. So we have 2001, 19 years ago. And if you looked up who had most RBIs, all time was Hank Aaron. So that really hasn't changed, but the active leader was Cal Ripken. And then in terms of, I guess the right side is single season, you've got Hack Wilson, who we talked about, with the corrected 191. And active, is that Manny Ramirez?
I think so. Yeah, it's hard to tell.
So
at that time, yeah.
It's great. It's visual, it's statistical. As you say, it's updated every 24 hours. To me, it's one of the highlights of this entire exhibit.
And you brought up the way that we used to do it, and believe me, that was not lost on the staff at the Hall of Fame. I mean, up until we opened this, up until 2011, we did have that old records room, and those would be updated weekly on foam core, stuff printed out by the exhibit staff, and then physically printed out on a printer, then going down there and plugging it in onto the wall, into the exhibit. So yeah, a lot's changed, and believe me, they're definitely happy that they don't have to do that.
Yeah, for the time it was pretty good, but we look now and it is amazing what can be done in terms of technology and computers. Another great visual, the 7 Nolan Ryan caps representing each of his no-hitters. Nolan had to cooperate here, providing caps from every one of these games, which is terrific.
Yeah, unbelievable, right? And this is, certainly a highlight of this part of the exhibit, and we talk about a whole bunch of pitching records, right, including 3,000 career strikeouts and 300 wins, and but this is the no-hitter case, and the Hall of Fame's attempted to get a ball from every no-hitter basically since we opened, I think since 1940. We opened in 1939, and for the most part have been successful. But in this case, Ryan gave us his cap as well for every one of those games, and boy, think about how amazing that is too, right? And the span of time in which he did that. The first one was 73 or 74, something like that, and then that last one in 91, which he says was his best. He was playing his best that day in that game for the Rangers. Tremendous generosity from Nolan for us to be able to have that there. And you can see in that photo on the right, we also talk about Sandy Koufax, who has 4 no-hitters, and then some other random pitchers for whom we had good artifacts to tell the no-hit story. No-hitters are one of those things in baseball that have this magic feeling, and we all know if we've ever been to the park and seen one for sure. But we even all remember if we simply watch one on television for the most part, and they'll cut into other programming to show the last inning of somebody trying to get a no-hitter, and so it's really one of those special moments in not just baseball history, sports history, that really captivates people. So we certainly felt it was worthy of having a case on no-hitters and perfect games, which I think is one of your next slides there. Yeah.
One
Now,
of the
perfect
highlights
games.
here, the mitt in the lower right-hand corner. Tell us about that.
Yeah, so that's Yogi Berra's from Don Larson's perfect game in the 1956 World Series, Game 5, 2-0 victory, and that's a famous moment in baseball history. Of course, famous imagery of Yogi jumping into his arms, and one of those singular moments, of course, being a postseason perfect game. And today's a special day too for Yogi. You were telling me this earlier, right?
Yeah, it would be the anniversary of his birthday today. He would have been 95.
Yeah, so happy birthday to Yogi. But that, of course, is one of the signature moments that's associated with him. We've added a bunch of perfect games in the last decade or so, and the number used to be quite diminished. I think it's up to about 27 games now or so, 27 times that's occurred. But you'll see some other artifacts there on that case, including Ron Hassey's mitt there in the middle. He's the only person to catch 2 perfect games. He caught Len Barker's perfect game for the Indians and Dennis Martinez's perfect game with the Expos. So that is a pretty cool artifact. We also have a non-major league artifact in there. That is not a Los Angeles Dodgers jersey. If anybody was thinking that was some strange, weird, modern version of a Sandy Koufax a perfect game jersey, that's not. That is a Little League jersey worn by a young lady named Katie Brownell. This is a number of years ago now, back in the 2000s, that she pitched a perfect game for her team. And of course, Little League games are 6 innings. Not only was it a perfect game where nobody got on base, she struck everybody out. So all 18 batters were strikeouts. And so, it's really fun when we get to kind of show baseball throughout all eras, even including amateur, and put that stuff into exhibits with major league players and show how important it is and how we feel about these marks. Something else that's in this case, you can't see it very well. To the left of the Colt 45's cap is a scorecard. And it's actually from the first perfect game ever in 1880 by a guy named John Lee Richmond. He pitched for the Worcester Ruby Legs, which was a team in the National League at that time. And it was called no walk, no hit, no man reach first was how it was discussed in the newspaper. The term perfect game was not given that meaning until Cy Young threw his perfect game in 1904. And that's the first time we saw that word associated with that feat of nobody getting on base. But so we have stuff ranging from 1880 to much more recent, and from Little League to the majors there. The other thing of note is that bag there is from Andres Galarraga in that awfully poignant moment where he had the almost perfect game that should have been a perfect game a few years back with the Tigers. And when Jim Joyce made the wrong call at first base, and that last call should have been an out, and he called the batter safe. And, I'm sure tremendously disappointing for him, but also a great life lesson. Because I remember how wonderfully Galarraga took that and basically said, hey, people make errors. And him and Jim Joyce, and they used it as a teaching moment. And I think parents around the country were like, take a look at how people can handle adversity when life doesn't turn out fair sometimes. So that was a story we wanted to tell here as well.
Yeah, in some ways, Armando Galarraga has drawn more praise for not throwing a perfect game. Simply because of the way he handled that situation.
Right. And of course, we realized that it really kind of should have been, right? So he's there in the perfect game case, and as he should be. And you're right, the way he handled it is certainly a testament to his character.
Here, the number 511 prominent, that of course, Cy Young's win total. I use the caption unbreakable in quotes. I guess in theory, no record is unbreakable, but this may be as close as you're going to get.
Yeah, people ask me all the time, what are those records that'll never be broken? This is one that certainly comes to mind. Breaking Johnny Vandermeer's record of 2 consecutive no-hitters by throwing 3 would be another one that I bring up. But Cy Young's 511 wins are amazing. You only see one part of it there, but those balls aren't just there randomly. That's actually 511 baseballs. We wanted to give people a visual reference of how many wins that was, that go behind that display, and they actually come around to the left where you can't see, and they're continued there. Think about how humongous that number is, right? If you pitched for 20 seasons and you had 25 wins a year, you'd still only have 500 wins. So how astronomical is that? You look at Cy Young's numbers. I think he had 11 seasons with more than 20 wins and 5 seasons with more than 30 wins. So, you know, you don't get to this number by coming out of games early, for sure, right? I mean, he also has the career record for losses, and the career record for games started. But when you look at those numbers, they're amazing. But to me, I have an even more favorite Cy Young number that I like to talk about when we talk about Cy Young, because everybody talks about 5'11". It's certainly the reason why we call the Cy Young Award the Cy Young Award to be given to the best pitcher in each league. But what I find even more staggering is his number of complete games. If you look at that, okay, so we're talking about pitching all of the game, 1 through 9 innings in a regular standard game. He did that 749 times. And I think he started 815 games. So you can do that percentage in your mind there. But how many times? It was rare that he would ever come out. I mean, he would go and he would pitch, you know, the whole thing. So I don't know. When I say that number to people, 749 complete games, they look at me like I'm making it up. You know, like I'm totally lying. That can't be possible. But it is. And you'd never have that now. Never have that now. You won't have 511 wins either. But not with the way that we use pitchers, unless something changes and we make a drastic 180.
We're going to look at a few more slides from One for the Books, then we'll start taking your questions in our chat room. Here, Erik, we have a case featuring the Grand Slam, some names that come up here, Lou Gehrig, Alex Rodriguez, and Fernando Tatis. Yeah,
all sorts of numbers there. So for the long time, Lou Gehrig had the record for career Grand Slams with 23. A-Rod eventually passed him, and we have some other Grand Slam bats there. We also talk about how many times there were 2 Grand Slams hit in a game, which has happened a number of times. I'm not sure, again, off the top of my head, a dozen times, something like that. And but that helmet there is perhaps from one of my favorites, and that's Fernando Tatis of the Cardinals, when he became the only player in history to hit 2 Grand Slams in 1 inning. Again, that's a feat that you need a lot of help with, both from your teammates and from the opposing pitcher having a horrible day. But that is certainly something that you're unlikely to see again, if not for a long time. We also have a Bill Miller Grand Slam bats in there. He hit a Grand Slam in the 2 Grand Slams in the game, switch hitting, 1 from each side of the plate. So we talk about Grand Slams there in that left case. That right case, we talk about 4 home run games. And that's been done only, you know, a handful of times as well. A very impossible feat. Probably, speaking of Lou Gehrig again, there's another player who had a 4 home run game, if you think about the stuff that he achieved. And the day that he did that, I believe it was in 1932, was the same day that John McGraw retired from being the manager of the New York Giants for 30 years or whatever it was. So he didn't even get top billing in the baseball sports pages for hitting 4 home runs in a game that day. So we talk about the 4 home run games, and then actually those last 3 bats on the right are for our consecutive games hitting a home run. That record is 8, and first done by Dale Long of the Pirates, then duplicated, that was in the 50s, duplicated by Don Mattingly in the 80s, and then by Ken Griffey Jr. Later on. And we have a bat for each of those guys who managed to hit a home run in 8 straight games. You know, there's so much about home runs that that you can talk about, and we didn't even go into that here. We could do a whole session on the career home run record and the single season home run records, right? We kind of went around and talked about some other things, so perhaps some other time. But home runs, you know, you have hits and all this stuff we're talking about, but you know, no hitters for pitchers, and then home runs for batters are where it's at, and everybody enjoys watching home runs and talking about home run numbers.
Base running is something that sometimes gets overlooked in the shuffle, but we've got an exhibit case in One for the Books about that. Obviously, Rickey Henderson, among others, prominently featured here.
Yeah, and of course, Rickey has 1406, again, a number that seems unattainable. He broke Lou Brock's record, which was 939, I believe, to become the record holder, and then eventually ended up with 1400. Those are his batting gloves up there in that top left corner. You can see a little metric on the right, and it's talking about how long the distance is if you added up 1406 stolen bases back to back. What would that equal? And I think it's about 24 miles. So he stole 24 miles worth of bases during his career, which seems like a heck of a lot because it is. Keep in mind a marathon's 26 miles. So he almost did a marathon worth of stolen bases throughout his baseball career. But something else we also talk about there is in how you tallied stolen bases. And the stolen base numbers are all over the map, particularly in the 19th century, and they weren't very consistent in how they tallied them and how they crewed them, how you figured out what was a stolen base and what wasn't, and the rules changed sporadically. So we have guys who have 7 bases in a game, and Hugh Nickel has the single season record of 138. But back then there were years when they would tally, you could get a stolen base on getting a hit from going from first to third, or taking an extra base on a fly ball out and tagging up. Could have counted as a stolen base. So it's very difficult to compare eras because it is apples and oranges, certainly. And stolen bases are no different in that regard.
Fielding records, Gold Glove winners. The image of Brooks Robinson certainly pops up here. We also see some Pudge Rodriguez and Eddie Murray as well.
Yeah, and that little map there shows you the guy who had the most career games played at each of those positions. So Pudge is, of course, at catcher, and Eddie Murray at first base, Jesse Orozco at pitcher, Eddie Collins at second, Omar Vizquel at short, Brooks Robinson at third, and Ty Cobb in the outfield. They have the records for most games played at each position. And then we have some artifacts from different guys that are on those lists there in that right side.
Looks like the Pudge Rodriguez uniform is from a short stint with the Astros, I believe.
Mm-hmm. Correct. Yeah.
And of course, the Murray is from his heyday with the Baltimore Orioles. And then finally, we have one of the lesser known players in this entire exhibit, an infielder named Erik Bruntlett. And he did something that really requires a lot of luck, but some heads up ability as well.
Yeah. So a little backstory there. Erik Bruntlett, of course, played for the Phillies back in the 2000s. And during the 2008 World Series, when the Phillies played the Tampa Bay Rays, and for some that may recall, that was crazy weather in Philadelphia, and I was there at the time. And it's actually snowed and blizzarded during one of the games, which was stopped, and they had to continue the game later. And really threw a wrench into a lot of stuff. But they had what we call those Elmer Fudd caps. So they weren't just baseball caps, but they were kind of like the hunting caps with the fold-down air flaps.
Yes.
And, we wanted to get one of those for the collection. And Jeff Idelson, our president, was like, okay, well, let me talk to our good friends at the Phillies, and let's see if maybe we get a cap from one of the guys who you probably won't see make it to the Hall of Fame and isn't going to be perhaps one of the superstars of the team. A team that was stocked with Jimmy Rollins and Ryan Howard and Chase Utley and those guys. So they're like, well, okay, why don't we do Erik Bruntlett? And it's like, awesome. He'll have his day in the sun, and we'll get his cap from that World Series that kind of talks about the weather and how crazy that was, and we'll put that in the collection. And then lo and behold, sure as shooting, right? You get to the next season in 2009, and Erik Bruntlett has an unassisted triple play. And Jeff has to go back to him. It's like, well, I guess we weren't done asking you for artifacts. Can we have a jersey from your unassisted triple play? Which is extremely rare. I mean, it's pretty much the rarest thing in baseball. I think it's happened 16 times. So, it requires, as you said, a whole bunch of circumstances. Requires guys. Normally, the normal one is a guy on first and second, and then the unassisted triple play happens with the second baseman or shortstop, where a ball is hit from the plate very sharply and the runners take off thinking it's a hit, and it's caught for the first out, right? And then they tag up the guy who left second base prematurely for the second out, and then the guy coming from first is already so close he can tag him. That's how a majority of them have occurred. But there's Erik Bruntlett there, and his second artifact in the Hall of Fame and in one of our permanent exhibitions.
And I think that ended the game, as you were telling me, right?
Oh, I'm not sure on that, Bruce.
Not
but
sure?
That could be, yeah.
We'll check on that. To the right of that, it says other records, a very tall John Rauch Minnesota Twins uniform.
Yeah, 6'11". And so we have things here like tallest, shortest. That's a little cardboard cutout of Eddie Goodell just to give people the idea of the shortest compared to the tallest. The oldest, Satchel Paige, the youngest, Joan Knox Hall. And then we get into all sorts of other sort of things like that for individuals. You know, most games managed, for example, or longest home run hit, which is not really provable, excuse me, as well as some other things on the right-hand side where we talk about team records, like, you know, most wins in a season, and then longest game by innings, longest game by time, largest attendance at a game, that sort of thing. And so those graphics are meant to give you an idea of how many people attended very famous events, like Woodstock, for example. Right, there you go.
Tell us about the clocks. It looks like an old-fashioned newsroom, but it's not what it is.
Right, and that's telling you what the longest time was in a game, the shortest time was in a game, and then comparing it to things. So like the shortest game ever played, Major League 9-inning game, was 51 minutes, I think. And then you can compare that to the movie Bambi, the Disney film Bambi, which lasted 100 minutes, longer than the shortest baseball game. So those are just to give you an idea of comparing how long a baseball game is to some other reference that you would have in mind in terms of length. And so it was just a fun way to do something with clocks to give people a better reference point on what those numbers really meant.
We have a few minutes remaining with Erik Strohl, so let's get to your questions in our chat room. Actually, the first is not a question, but a comment from Patricia. And she just wants to note, I love this exhibit, the way the graphics, etc., were done, just outstanding. So I know Erik and everybody else in the curatorial department will appreciate that.
Thank you, Patricia.
Yeah, let's go to a question from Mike Swartz. So what do you consider the most unbreakable of all these unbreakable records?
Yeah, okay, we kind of hinted at that a little bit, right? But I think it would go to the ones I'm talking about because the way that pitching has changed so much and how we use pitchers, the longevity records of most wins and most complete games, I think, are absolutely unbeatable, unless there's some dire way in which we played the game. I also mentioned you have to pitch 3 consecutive no-hitters to beat that mark. And we talk about pitching numbers changing now, right? Like, so what used to be 300 wins is now we're thinking 250 wins, right? To attain that milestone. Those numbers are all going down because of the way that the way we use pitchers has evolved. So, I'll go back to the ones that I mentioned. I don't know if you posted that question before or after we were talking about that, but those are the ones I always bring up when people ask me. I think hitting records are more approachable because you can always have that anomalous season. That hasn't changed as drastically as pitching in terms of the way the game is played.
Question from Deb Williams, a very good one, I think. Erik, as errors are found in records and statistics, do you then go back and alter the exhibit, specifically this exhibit, to reflect the changes?
So, yeah, it's a great question. If there is a number that is changed and the accepted number is now something different, yes, we would go back and go in our exhibits and change that. Now, we may not go into an explanation why, because again, it's not a book or a magazine article where we have the space to explain it. But it's certainly defendable then, right, if somebody asks us. So that's something where I can go in an exhibit, and by the way, most of the stuff we do in exhibits, we manufacture and we fabricate, particularly when it comes to all the graphics and labels and stuff, in the museum. So it's easy for us to go in and just print something new and put it out. There's a caveat to that, however, and that would be the Hall of Fame plaques. And so we are asked that question there. And for anyone who's been to the plaque gallery, you may notice that we kind of have a disclaimer posted in there that talks about the numbers on the plaques were accurate as far as we could tell at the time that the plaques were made. But we do not go back and then change numbers on a plaque if numbers changed through some sort of research, because that would be obviously an awfully expensive undertaking. And that plaque reflects a moment in time when it was presented to that Hall of Famer or his family member. So that itself is an artifact. That plaque is an artifact, part of the collection. So we wouldn't change that. But as far as the other exhibit goes, yeah, we would try to reflect the most accurate scholarship and what research has found to be what's correct as far as we know it as of that day.
Here's a really interesting question from Isaac Stevenson, one of our regular viewers. He wants to know, are wins above replacement, is that a statistic in the exhibit now? If not, might it be in the future?
So yes, when we did this almost a decade ago, even in that last 10 years, these newer measurements, the sabermetrics measurements, as some would call them, have become more and more pronounced, right, as tools to evaluate, certainly by teams and by management. There is, at some point, we certainly might look at addressing adding something into this exhibit if we, if we can figure out a way to do it without altering the layout of how we have things here. It's not a bad idea, because what his question points to is that, and what we've talked about throughout this whole discussion is how things evolve and change, and then that changes the meaning of things. So, not that these new measurements change things that drastically. It's just a different tool to open our eyes to look at something in a different way. So maybe we can go back and retroactively look at what those numbers might be. Wins above replacement, which is how many wins a player would have. It's a very complex formula, more than the average player who would replace him. So yeah, great question, and that's something that we talked about a little bit. Haven't implemented anything yet, but most permanent exhibits, so to speak, in the museum world can last 20 to 25 years maybe, and this one's 9 years old. So we'll see what happens, as we move forward. But certainly, even in the last decade, the way that people measure things and those exact tools have evolved and changed.
Just two more comments rather than questions. Andrew Deal points out that he was at the Erik Bruntlett game, and that unassisted triple play did end the game.
There you go. Thank you.
Yeah. And this other one, this is kind of a funny one. I'm not meaning to embarrass you, Erik, but a gentleman named Rick Keller Coffee is pointing out that you look a lot like one of our Hall of Famers, Jack Morris. Have you ever heard that before?
Yes.
You have? Really?
I've had some other friends point that out. Yeah. And Jack's a great company.
Right.
Jack's a great guy, and was a tremendous competitor, one of the best pitchers in baseball.
It reminds me of the time that I was stationed to do kind of a talk in the Plaque Gallery. Not really a talk. I was there to answer questions from people. It was kind of an assignment rotated among all the full-time staff. And we would each spend a couple of hours in the gallery just sort of, commiserating with people, answering their questions. And I remember a guy started looking at me, and I'm about 6'4" and pretty tall, and he just kept staring at me, and I didn't know what was going on. Then finally he comes up to me and very sheepishly said, "Are you Steve Carlton?" So that was the first time anybody confused me with Steve Carlton, who I think is about 6'7", so I'm about 3 inches shorter than him. So we have a Hall of Fame doppelganger, if you will.
Yeah. Well, and back to that comment too, I do have to say, of course, right, with what's going on in the world today, my hair certainly looks like I might have been playing baseball in the 1980s as it continues to grow. So perhaps another reason why that observation seemed keen at the moment.
Yeah, I had never thought of the Jack Morris thing, but the more I think of it, I guess there's a faint resemblance there. Erik, we really appreciate your time over the last hour. It's been great talking about One for the Books. When our museum opens, we still don't know when that's going to happen, hopefully sometime during the summer. And when it does, go up to the 3rd floor, check out the room full of records, milestones, and great stories about them. One for the Books. Thank you, Erik. Appreciate it.
Bruce, my pleasure. And to everybody out there, thank you for joining us this afternoon. And as Bruce says, we look forward to seeing you in Cooperstown. Coming to upstate New York might seem like a good idea up here in basically rural upstate New York. Get away from things for a bit and come visit us and come enjoy this exhibit as well as all our others. And we can't wait to have people come back. So thanks, Bruce, for having me again, and to everyone who watched, and we'll see you next time.
And just to let folks know, we've got more programs coming up later in the week. Tomorrow, that's Wednesday, May 13th, we're going to do a virtual field trip for students and adults, Batter Up. That's about baseball and math, so a little more in the statistical theme. Friday, virtual Voices of the Game. Our guest at 11 a.m. Eastern Time is Tyler Kepner, a great baseball writer for the New York Times. And I also want to mention the following 2 Fridays, We've got some other great guests lined up. Friday, May 22nd, we're going to talk to former Major Leaguer Al Oliver. He's going to talk to us about Clemente, Stargell, Mazeroski, some of the Hall of Famers he played with, also talk about his own career. And then on Friday, May 29th, Ben Mankiewicz of Turner Classic Movies. He's a big baseball fan, loves the Oakland A's, and he's going to talk about baseball films. So that'll be coming up May 29th, Friday at 1 p.m. So that's all coming up. We hope you've enjoyed our virtual Curator Spotlight with Erik Strohl of the Hall of Fame. Thanks, everybody, for being with us. Have a great day.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.
Thanks, Erik. Good job.